Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order for the purpose of inquiring to the Majority Leader the schedule for next week.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
And Madam Speaker, I also ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you. With that, I would be happy to yield to my friend, the Majority Leader, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, on Monday, the House will meet at 12 p.m. for morning hour and 2 p.m. for legislative business, with votes postponed, as usual, until 6:30 p.m. On Tuesday, the House will meet at 10 a.m. for morning hour and 12 p.m. for legislative business. And on Wednesday, the House will meet at 12 p.m. for legislative business. On Thursday, the House will meet at 9 a.m. For legislative business. The House will consider, Madam Speaker, several bills under suspension of the rules. The complete list of suspension bills will be announced by the close of business today. With a short-term extension of the Surface Transportation Program through October 31st, the House will aim to consider the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Build Back Better Act this work period. In addition, the House will consider H.R. 2119, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Improvement Act of 2021, sponsored by Lucy McBath of Georgia. That bill modifies and expands and reauthorizes through fiscal year 26 the Family Violence and Prevention Services Program, which funds emergency shelters and supports related assistance for victims of domestic violence. If time allows, Madam Speaker, the House may also consider H.R. 3992, the Protecting Older Jobs Applicant Act, which allows applicants to bring disparate impact claim under the Age Discrimination and Employment Act of 1967 when they experience age discrimination while seeking a job. Lastly, additional legislative items may be possible when and if they are ready. And I thank my friend for yielding.
I thank the gentleman. And as we go through the bills that may come up next week, of course, we just finished a week bringing some bills to the floor. But as we look around the country, clearly the main concern we're hearing from families are all of the various crises that are facing American families. You've got an inflation crisis with goods of all kinds costing dramatically more when people go to buy things at the grocery store. If they try to get a new appliance, they're waiting longer, they're paying more money. You think about the energy crisis with families paying 50% more for gasoline in some cases, with dramatic increases at the pump and the pain that it causes, especially lower income families. The border crisis, where every day we see stories of thousands of people coming across our border illegally. The Attorney General was before the Judiciary Committee, and he couldn't even give a number of how many people have illegally crossed or a plan to address it. The supply chain crisis that we see getting worse and worse with ships backed up maybe almost all the way to China because that crisis is not being addressed. And so when you think about all these crises that families are angry about, it's hurting hardworking families, it's costing them, it's taking money out of their paychecks. There's not been a single bill brought to this floor last week. Doesn't sound like any being brought to the floor next week to address any of those crises. And I would ask the gentleman, would he be open to bringing actual legislation to the floor to address the various serious crises that families are facing today? And I would yield.
I thank the gentleman for his comments and question. Let me say that I mentioned two bills that will have a very, very substantial impact on the welfare of Americans, of families, of their health, and yes, even of their environmental security in the Build Back Better plan and the BIF plan, which is a bipartisan bill on the Senate side. I hope to bring both of those bills to the floor next week if they're ready. Unfortunately, we don't have help from your side on either of those bills, so it's more difficult to get unanimity on our side of the aisle. I will tell my friend, all those problems that you mentioned would be extraordinarily worse if we hadn't passed the American Rescue Plan in March of this year, which helped families extraordinarily generously to stay above water. Not a single person on your side of the aisle voted for those. So when the gentleman asked me, are we going to bring legislation to the floor, we brought it to the floor. You all opposed it, however, unfortunately. that helped families, helped child care, helped health care, helped health workers, helped states, all to meet the pandemic that this administration inherited. The pandemic was not the previous administration's fault, obviously, but the failure to deal with it effectively was their fault. So I tell you that 5 million jobs have been created since this administration took office. Some people lamented the 233,000 jobs that were last month, how awful that was. In the best year that Donald Trump had, that was his average production of jobs. In the best year he had, which was from January 18 to January 2019. So I will tell my friend, we hope to be able to bring these bills to the floor. We think they will have very substantial positive effect. We inherited, of course, because of the pandemic, again, not the fault of any, but well, we don't know whether it was the fault of somebody purposely, but in any event, whatever reasons, extraordinary amounts of people were laid off around the world. And then, because of the rescue plan, we finally gave some people to get resources that they could buy things that they had needed and wanted for them and their families. And now we have a supply shortage. The President acted through executive order, as the gentleman knows, to make sure that we had a 24/7 operation at the ports, off Long Beach, off other ports in our country, to try to make sure that we, got goods on those ships that you say are to China. I don't know whether they're to China, but there are a lot of them. You're absolutely right on that. To get them offloaded, get them on trucks, and to get them to where they can be distributed and available, both for businesses, and then of course, we have a substantial shortage of chips, as the gentleman knows, which was caused by a lockdown in the major producers, Singapore being one, of chips. So we are dealing with that. The executive is dealing with that as well. But I very much hope the gentleman will help us get that legislation passed, which will make a major difference. Who says? 14 or 17 laureates who wrote to the White House and said, if these bills pass, it's not only going to help jobs, it's not going to help climate, it's not only going to help health, but it's also going to help bring down inflation, which is a problem. Why do we have inflation? Because we have too many dollars chasing too few goods, and so prices go up. That's true of employment as well, which probably is good news in terms of salaries going up for people around the country. So I tell my friend that we do have some very substantial, important legislation that we are trying to get done. It would be a lot easier to get it done if we had help from your side of the aisle. And your answer will be, well, it'd be very helpful if you take some of our ideas. I get that. But I will tell you also, we have something, the gentleman's concerned about all those issues. If we don't protect the full faith and credit of the United States of America, they will all get disastrously worse. And not one of you is prepared in a debt that we all created. All of us. Not all on the same thing. It may have been cutting revenues. It may have been increasing spending, this, that, and the other. We all essentially voted for very substantial spending last year to meet the crisis of the pandemic. All of us did. The CARES Act, with the largest of those, $2 trillion, was unanimously passed. Voice vote in one instance. So the only thing I would say to the gentleman is we are very, very concerned about what's happening. We're very glad that we've created 5 million jobs. 9 million jobs were lost the year before that under Mr. Trump. He had a net loss of $2 million jobs, a net loss of 2 million jobs. We get talking about trillions, 2 million jobs over his 4 years, a net loss of 2 million jobs. This president has a net gain. We're going to try to continue that, and I hope we get some help from your side of the aisle, and I'll yield to my friend.
Thank the gentleman, and clearly we stand ready to help on all of those issues, but if Washington spending and borrowing money solved the problem, we would not have any of these crises because trillions of dollars have been borrowed and spent under this administration. In the previous administration, we worked together on those budget deals. every one of them, the Paycheck Protection Program, the CARES Act, they were all very bipartisan, and it included addressing the debt that went along with it. There's been nothing bipartisan in any of the debt that's been racked up under this administration. And so if the gentleman's concerned about the full faith and credit of the United States, which we all are, then stop borrowing and spending trillions more dollars. But families get this, by the way. Families know if spending trillions was going to solve the problem, there wouldn't be a problem because trillions have been borrowed and spent just from January to October. What they know is it is the very borrowing and spending of trillions of dollars in Washington that has exacerbated these problems. The inflation crisis would not exist if you didn't have Washington borrowing and spending trillions more dollars, making it harder for people to get back into the workforce, making it harder for the supply chain to be addressed. You know, what was inherited? I think we know what was inherited by the Biden administration. We had energy dominance the day President Biden took the oath of office. Not only were we producing enough energy for our needs, gas was less than $2 a gallon all across America, we were exporting oil and natural gas to our friends around the world. We were undermining our enemies around the world. Instead of President Biden begging OPEC and Russia to produce more oil, we were actually shipping oil to our friends because we could produce enough for ourselves. We created great American jobs here at home. We had low-cost energy. And by the way, the technological advances we made here in this country, if there's anywhere in the world where fossil fuel production is going to be done, you want it done here because we've actually lowered carbon emissions. We were lowering carbon emissions in America while producing more energy. Now that we've become more reliant on OPEC nations, on Russia, not only is that bad for American families, they're paying more at the pump because of that crisis created by President Biden's actions. Inherited an energy-dominant nation. Now you have the President of the United States begging OPEC and Russia to produce more oil, which they're not going to do because they want oil to be over $80 a barrel. But they actually emit more carbon to produce the same oil. So oil is going to be needed to run an economy, any economy, anywhere in the world. You want to make it here because we do it better than anybody else, but that's not what's being done. We have an answer for it. I know last night President Biden was asked specifically about this crisis that he created, and his response was, quote, "I don't have a near-term answer for high gas prices." Well, President Biden might not have an answer, but we do. We have a number of bills, and I know the gentleman's pointed out, we have a number of answers. Here's one, H.R. 684, green lights the Keystone Pipeline. You want to talk about creating thousands of good jobs, private sector money, more energy independence for America? This bill would do just that, and it would do it today. And if pipelines were a problem, I know President Biden doesn't want American pipelines, but he greenlighted the Russian pipeline, the Nord Stream 2. So clearly it's not pipelines, it's American pipelines he doesn't want. Why don't we bring up H.R. 684, create jobs, lower energy costs? H.R. 543, H.R. 859 would both greenlight more production in America that President Biden shut down. There was production going on all across America. Really good, safe, environmentally sound production. That's, again, our standards are the best in the world. For people that want to bash America, go find a country that produces energy that does it better than America. We do it best, and yet President Biden, through executive action, shut a lot of that production down. These bills would open that back up again. These bills would lower gas prices. But I know President Biden isn't interested in that because in his own budget, in President Biden's budget, he specifically blocks the Corps of Engineers from doing infrastructure projects that would lower energy production. President Biden blocks that. You would think OPEC would have come up with that idea. Maybe Russia would have come up with that idea. No, that was President Biden in his own budget said you can't even do infrastructure projects if it lowers energy production. Who would come up with that? But yet that's in his budget. And so then you go to the border crisis. Again, self-created. President Biden inherited a secure border. A wall was being built. You had agreements with South America, Central American countries. Remain in Mexico was a great policy that President Biden reversed. He blocked it. Well, did he block it because it was bad policy? No, it was working really well, and it was agreement between two neighboring countries. He just blocked it because President Trump did it. It was working, and yet he got rid of it. He could go and reinstate that tomorrow. But we have bills that would solve the border crisis. Here, I'll read a few of them off. H.R. 4828. This is a bill I brought to the majority leader's attention back a month ago in September. This is a bill that deals with a number of problems facing our border today, and it would give more tools to our Border Patrol agents to secure our border. H.R. 471, another bill that I brought to the gentleman's attention a month ago that would help secure America's border, dealing with the crisis. None of these bills seem to draw the interest of the majority, even though every one of them would address these very real crises facing families. Not that were around a year ago. President Biden inherited a secure border, inherited energy dominance, inherited an economy that was recovering from the worst pandemic we've seen in lifetimes. And instead, with all of these actions, and then on top of that, there's a proposal to raise trillions more in taxes, more in Soviet-style spending coming out of Washington. That would make inflation worse. Gentleman's correct. We don't support those ideas that would make inflation worse, that would raise gas prices even higher, but we bring a lot of good ideas that would address these crises. We just want to see these ideas brought to the floor. When you look at the floor schedule, and there's nothing last week, next week, a month ago to address any of these crises. And these are the things that families are having the hardest time with. They're struggling. Inflation is the biggest tax on lower and middle income families. President Biden promised he wouldn't raise taxes on anybody making less than $400,000. And yet, in the tax proposal that President Biden wants to bring forward by next week so that he can go fly to Europe and talk about other proposals that would make it impossible to produce energy in America, they include, among other things, a natural gas tax. That tax would fall the hardest on lower income families. Not the millionaires and the billionaires. It would be people making less than $60,000 that would be hit the hardest by a natural gas tax, yet it's in the bill. You know, you talk about adding 83,000 IRS agents. Maybe some people in Washington think that's job creation. Most people in America have shivers running down their spine at the thought of the federal government, who now wants to track every transaction if they make more than $10,000 a year, to track all their transactions with 83,000 new IRS agents. Again, maybe to some that's called infrastructure. To most people, it's called a nightmare right before Halloween. Why don't we bring bills to the floor to address these crises? And if these aren't the bills that the majority likes, let's work on some other ones. But all of these would address these problems, and many of them would get us back to the point where we were, where we had a secure border, where we had energy dominance, where we had jobs being created well above what each of these last few months you've seen jobs created dramatically lower than what the projections were, because there are all of these self-created crises by the administration that are making it harder on hard-working families. It's the lowest income families that are being hit the hardest by these failed policies and all the big government socialist spending coming out of Washington. We don't need more. We need to actually go and confront the problem that's creating a debt crisis and all the other crises that families are facing. It's not going to be by spending more money and taxing people more. It's going to be by working to address each of them, starting at the root of the problem and what created them. And I would yield.
I think I can respond, nor do I intend to respond to each one of those assertions, but I noticed that the gentleman ignored totally the facts. The presentation the gentleman made, Madam Speaker, was as if the Republican policies were in place, we'd be in high cotton. Let me remind the gentleman, Donald Trump was president. You were in the majority. Republicans were in the majority, Madam Speaker. And over those 4 years, we lost a net 2.876 million people from jobs. The last 12 months of the Trump administration, 9,416,000 jobs were lost. The best year, let me remind you, the best year you had 2,820,000 new jobs. That is about an average of 235,000 jobs a month. Last month, where we all wring our hands because it came down substantially from expectations, it was 233,000. In other words, the wringing of the hands over the poor job performance you seem to reflect was the average of Mr. Trump's best year. And in fact, under this administration, helped by a bill, the American Rescue Plan, that every Republican voted against. What was the difference between the first 5 bills of 20 that were passed and the bill of 21 that every Republican voted against? Donald Trump was president. And then Joe Biden was president. It's like the debt limit, Madam Speaker. They know the debt limit has to be raised, or all of the things that the gentleman just referenced are going to be hurt very, very badly. So before you start criticizing people for not doing things to help, why don't you stop hurting the ability of the United States to present a balanced fiscal posture to our own economy and to the rest of the world, and have some certitude that America is going to remain fiscally responsible and viable and pay its bills? I don't know the answer to that question. Perhaps, Madam Speaker, the gentleman from Louisiana knows. Now, Louisiana is not yet. The gentleman from Louisiana comes from a very important, critical, energy-producing state of our nation. I don't blame him for being concerned about energy. He ought to be. We ought to all be. But very frankly, we ought to also be very concerned about global warming, which the national security apparatus of the United States of America, even during the Trump administration, said was one of the biggest existential threats to the welfare of our people and the global community. So yes, we are very concerned about reaching an environment which is not dangerous for life on this planet. That's a very big issue for us. You're right. And we're going to deal with that in the Build Back Better plan. We are dealing with it, and we're dealing with it in the BIF plan. Now, the BIF plan is a plan to spend $1.2 trillion on infrastructure investment over the next 10 years, which will make our country more competitive, will increase our ability to produce goods here in America, make it in America, which will make us more independent and self-sufficient. We found during the pandemic we weren't as self-sufficient as we should be and wanted to be. These bills that we're considering will do that. I don't expect many Republicans to vote for it. Even the transportation bill that I think they ought to be for, Donald Trump said he was going to spend $1 trillion, have a $1 trillion infrastructure program during his campaign. And then we went down to the White House, we had a meeting with him. He said, no, $1 trillion is not enough, we ought to do $2 trillion. He did zero, Madam Speaker, zero. When the Republicans were there in charge, zero. Now, we're going to pass this infrastructure bill, and it's going to make a real difference. It's going to make a real difference on jobs. It's going to make a real difference on inflation. It's going to make a real difference because we can increase the supply chain. It's going to make a real difference on the health of our globe. So I will tell the gentleman that he raises a lot of issues. And I would hope his party would start returning to a sense of bipartisanship in dealing with the legitimate problems that the gentleman raises, which we did in 2020. Now, we were in the minority. We voted with President Trump. Actually, we were in the majority, but President Trump was president, and we helped support his and the Treasury Secretary's objectives and our own objectives, and we came to agreement, bipartisan agreement. Very frankly, it is unbelievable to me, Madam Speaker, that in the debt limit, the Minority Leader of the United States Senate, and very frankly, the gentleman just said, we all understand, we don't want to, I presume he doesn't believe we ought to not raise our debt limit. I believe he wants us to pay our bills because he knows the catastrophic impact if we don't. But I don't understand why they won't support that. That's not an issue of Democrat or Republican. We all created that debt in one form or another. And certainly last year, we did a big number because we thought we needed to meet the pandemic, and we did, and we saved millions of jobs in the process. So my friend has these bills. We have bills. We're prepared to talk about proposals, as I've told my friend in the past. But very frankly, there needs to be, on some issues that ought not to be political at all, like the debt limit, a statement that we are loyal to our country, not to Democrats. I said this the other day to the gentleman, the loyal opposition, not to Democrats, not to me as the majority leader, not to any of us, but to the country. And I would implore my friend because we're going to have to do the debt limit. We're going to have to do an omnibus. We're going to have to do the debt limit. We want to do Build Back Better. We want to do the infrastructure bill. Those are 4 pieces of big legislation we want to do before December 3rd. And I'm hopeful that we can get some cooperation from the Republicans. And I mentioned the debt limit because that is an issue that you came to us under the Trump administration and asked us to help with. We knew it was critical for the interests of the country, and on 3 different occasions, we voted with the President at the Secretary of Treasury under the Trump administration's request and voted to make sure that America did not default on its bills. Can I ask the gentleman, will at least, Madam Speaker, the gentleman indicate that they will support making sure that America continues to pay its bills? And I yield my time.
Thank the gentleman, and I sure hope that the gentleman is concerned not just about making sure the credit card bill is paid, but making sure that the spending that maxed out the credit card is being done responsibly.
And there's some key facts.
There are some key facts the gentleman left out in his conversation about how we got here. Because we got here because in January, one party, the Democrat Party, who is in the majority in the House, is in the majority in the Senate, and has control of the White House, made a decision. I don't agree with the decision, but made a decision that they were going to go it alone on the spending side. They decided that they were going to go max out the credit card. We urged them not to do it. We still to this day are urging not to go and just spend trillions and trillions more dollars. If you want to work with us on what the responsible decision should be, we're right here. We've been here from the beginning. Do you know to this day, President Biden has not met, we're in October, late October, President Biden has not met with the House Republican leadership on any of these issues, any of them. The gentleman referenced a number of opportunities where, as it was described, we were there to help President Trump. You weren't just there to help President Trump. You were in the meetings when the decisions were being made. Paycheck Protection Program was not a partisan exercise. In fact, it was one of the most successful bipartisan exercises I've seen Congress come together and do. Everybody was in the room making those decisions. They were all very important decisions, big decisions, involved a lot of money, and we all made those decisions together. We all voted for those bills together, and then ultimately the spending that went along with it, the debt that went along with it was part of that negotiation, and we voted for it together. There's not been a decision made this year where the majority has negotiated with the minority to figure out if we could come to agreement, so you did it on your own. And look, you had the votes to do it. But when you max out the credit card on your own, don't come and chide our side and say, well, you need to be there to pay the bill when we weren't included in the decision to max out the credit card. And now that the credit card's maxed out, it's not like there's an effort to slow down. In fact, it seems like it's full steam ahead. Damn the torpedoes. Spend trillions of dollars more on additional things like, again, 83,000 more IRS agents. Do you think anybody on this side supports that? That's not something we support. And it will rack up more debt, by the way. We don't support it, but I guess you expect we should pay for it even if we don't support it. Maybe if there was a negotiation where both sides were part of it. Sam Gray is the ranking member of the Transportation Committee, has not been included in any of these decisions on infrastructure. Yet I'm sure you would expect him to vote for whatever comes out of a partisan exercise. That's not how things work, and I know the gentleman knows that. But again,
Will
if the
gentleman
president wanted to
yield?
work with us, and
Or
and
you're just going to
look,
continue to say facts that are not
the
true?
gentleman, of course, those are true.
They're not true.
We all negotiated on the 3 different debt ceiling increases that happened under the Trump administration, including CARES, Paycheck Protection Program. They were very bipartisan. Does the gentleman disagree with that?
I do not disagree with it.
Those are the facts. And so when you look at those facts, the gentleman talked about jobs and COVID. Before COVID happened, we had the hottest economy maybe in the history of our country. Wages were up for every demographic group. Those are facts. You saw small businesses up, women-owned small businesses were up over 20%. African-American unemployment was at its lowest level. Hispanic unemployment at its lowest level. And then COVID came along. You know, maybe there's a reason why the majority won't hold a hearing on the origin of COVID. But if you want to just say because of COVID, all of that is Donald Trump's fault, clearly the economy shut down. And we worked to get it back going again, and it's coming back. And frankly, some of the efforts to pay people not to work, and it's not just enhanced unemployment, it's a whole list of things, are hurting the recovery. But those things were happening before COVID hit a year and a half ago. And it was because of good, sound policies that got us a secure border, that got us energy dominance. And frankly, it was things like that that helped us get the economy going again because it was creating good jobs. Keystone Pipeline was moving forward. Those are good union jobs, by the way. And that was ended by President Biden unilaterally. Never even tried to have a meeting and a conversation with us to see if we could come to agreement. And again, I guess it's the prerogative of the majority. If you're in the majority, you don't have to talk to the minority. But just because you didn't talk to the minority, you made decisions on your own about what you wanted to do. You didn't try to reach agreement with us. To come to us after the fact when you've spent trillions of dollars, it's wreaked havoc through our economy, it's led to inflation we haven't seen in generations, gas prices we haven't seen in decades. Then you want to come and not ask us how to fix it. We've got ideas on how to fix it. You ask us to pay the bill. Why don't we work together on the front end and not rack up trillions more in spending, because the things the gentleman talked about would rack up trillions more in spending, which created these problems, which we were not a part of those conversations. I wish we were part of the conversations, and it was done in a bipartisan way. But again, President Biden, 10 months into his administration, has yet to sit down and meet with House Republican leadership to talk about any of these ideas and solutions we could come up with together, which is how it should be done. And I would yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The reason I said he was misstating the facts, we have a bipartisan bill. It wasn't done by the Democratic leadership. It frankly wasn't done by the Republican leadership. It's done by members of the United States Senate on the Republican side and on the Democratic side. And that bill was sent over here with almost half of the Republicans in the United States Senate voting for it. And your leadership is lobbying against that infrastructure bill, which would help all the issues you raised. You're urging a no vote on that. And you're threatening members who are going to vote for it, maybe not very many, because they know it is a bipartisan bill. So when I hear, Madam Speaker, the whip is talking about bipartisanship, there has been so little bipartisanship, and when there is bipartisanship, their members are disciplined. When there's bipartisanship on saying that it wasn't a protest, it was an insurrection, there was no bipartisanship on that. It was we don't care what it was. We don't care that some people were killed. We don't really care that they were trying to stop the counting of votes for President of the United States of America. It was just a protest. That's what the President Trump, former president, said the other day. What a bunch of hooey. There clearly has been a conscious decision made by the leadership on the other side of the aisle, Madam Speaker, against a bill that had 69 votes in the United States Senate. We only have 50. And it's being lobbied against by, why? To hurt Joe Biden. Yes, they voted, Madam Speaker, for the 5 bills. Why? Because ultimately Donald Trump was for them. Not everybody voted for him, but the majority. And as I said, CARES, $2 trillion, absolutely essential, was passed. But The gentleman refuses to answer the question except to say, well, the credit card was maxed out. The credit card was maxed out by date in a couple of those votes, which we helped as the responsible opposition. As we did with John Boehner and Paul Ryan when they couldn't get votes to pass bills to keep government open or to keep the United States from defaulting. Yes, we cast the responsible vote. It's not a popular vote because it's demagogue, Madam Speaker. It has nothing to do with the debt. The debt has when you pass spending or pass revenue cuts. That's what affects the debt. And that's what all of us do, one way or the other. And so we're all responsible. And we ought to all be responsible, but the Senate leader on the Republican side of the aisle has said he's not going to do anything. Not only will he not do anything, Madam Speaker, he will not allow the majority to do it on their own. Because he is going to filibuster. So it requires 60 votes. We don't have 60 votes. We have 51. So not only will they not do the responsible thing on debt, which would adversely affect, if we do not extend it, all of the things that the minority whip lamented were wrong. Would all be adversely affected if, for the first time in history, Madam Speaker, we failed to extend the debt limit, which, by the way, very few countries have, one or two, because it's a phony issue. The debt's not phony, but the limit is controlled by what budgets we pass, what tax cuts we pass, what policies we pass. And once we do that, we go in the store, as Jim McGovern, the chair of the Rules Committee, we go in the restaurant, we buy the steak. You need to pay for the steak. And the argument, Madam Speaker, of, oh, well, you're proposing a lot of spending in the future, totally unrelated. The debt limit is caused by the debt that we already incurred. Two bills that we have, they don't affect the debt limit. We've met it now, not when we pass these bills, not after we make that commitment. We have a debt limit coming up now on December 3rd, which was totally irresponsible in and of itself, for political reasons only, coterminous with the funding of government. 2019, when we took over, the government was shut down. We spent a lot of time opening it up. That hurt the economy. That hurt jobs. Now, at that point in time, it didn't hurt inflation. And I've been amazed over the years, over the last 10 years, that we haven't had more inflation for a number of reasons. But he didn't answer the question whether he'd help on that. That's not for us. It's not for Democrats. It's not for Republicans. It's for our country. It's for our economy. It's for global fiscal stability. So I would hope at least in that area, not for us. I'm not asking you to do it for me, or Madam Speaker, I'm not asking anybody to do it for me or for my party or for the President of the United States. Mitch McConnell says it's the country and the global community that could not afford default. And that's true. Let me tell you, I think that's the first step to showing bipartisan responsibility together, not for one another, but for our country, Madam Speaker. And I hope that at some point in time we can show that kind of good faith and also show some good faith. I included this morning the remarks that President George W. Bush made in Pennsylvania, Shanksville, and the kind of America that he wanted to see. I would hope all my Republican colleagues would read what George W. Bush had to say. It is so much different from the rhetoric of the current leader of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, in terms of bringing us together as a country. I yield.
Thank the gentleman. I'd be happy to answer the question. Might not be the answer the gentleman wants, but I would be happy to be a part of an actual bipartisan negotiation on how to solve our country's debt. That has not happened. But if you look at the bill that the gentleman brought to this floor to deal with the debt over a month ago, it absolutely dealt with spending, not that already happened, but that will happen in the future, including the trillions of dollars of debt-laden bills that spend more money in Washington. And it picked a date, and the date that the gentleman put in the bill he brought to this House floor was December 31st of 2022. That's not spending we've already done. That's spending that the majority plans to do in a very partisan way, not just through this year, but through all of next year. And when we're not even included in those decisions, then you come and say, well, you should just be expected to pay for whatever we want to spend, trillions more, between now and the end of a year and over a year from now. That's not a negotiation. That's not even an attempt to want to work with the other side. Now, again, gentleman's in the majority. In the Senate, they're in the majority. And the gentleman very well knows that both sides have the ability, if you want to do the spending on your own, to address the debt that would be created by all of that spending on your own. Doesn't take 60 votes. Gentleman's well aware that there's a legislative instrument that if all the spending wants to be done in a partisan way, and I'm talking about the trillions that are still laying in front of us, that the gentleman said may come to the floor next week, not necessarily will, might come to the floor a month from now, might come to the floor a year from now. And we won't even be included in those negotiations, but we ought to be expected to vote for the debt that would be racked up by it. If the other side were being asked to do that, you know your majority wouldn't go for that. But we wouldn't do it. We would at least include you in a negotiation. If we didn't want to, then we would be responsible for doing it on our own if we did the spending on our own. And the tools are there to do just that. Threatening to default on the nation's debt when legislative instruments are included in this majority to not have default is irresponsible. And that threat keeps being thrown out there by the majority, even though the majority knows they could, with a majority vote in the House and a majority vote in the Senate, address the debt that wants to be racked up between now and next December. Again, I would urge that all of that new spending doesn't happen, that we come together and negotiate what budget limits should be, like we've done in the past, under Republican and Democrat presidents. Those were bipartisan deals. There's been no bipartisan attempt to do that this year. And why is there an opposition to infrastructure? Well, first of all, if there was a desire to do bipartisan infrastructure, you're going to find a lot of takers over here. And I know the gentleman made an assertion, probably not realizing, but there have been no threats made on our side of the aisle on a bill. Now, I see people being followed in the bathrooms on the other side and all kind of other things being done. No threats on this side. What we've said is we want an infrastructure negotiation, but the day that the deal was reached in the Senate with the president, he turned around about an hour later and undermined that deal by tying it, linking it to the tax and spend bill. That's when it became a problem, because taxing and spending trillions more dollars would be a problem to this country. It would hurt middle-class families and lower-income families to have that natural gas tax, to have all the additional inflation on top of the inflation they already see. All of those reasons are why that package, not the individual bill, because as the president himself has said multiple times, as the speaker herself has said multiple times, it's not a standalone bill. It's not two standalone bills. It is a package. They're married together at the hip. That's where the opposition comes from. And by the way, there is a really good bipartisan infrastructure bill that's out there. S-3011 came over from the Senate unanimously. About $500 billion of infrastructure is authorized in this bill. I would ask the gentleman if he would bring this up for a vote. It would probably fly overwhelmingly, and it would allow for, again, about $500 billion immediately that could be spent on infrastructure all across this country, plus an additional large sum next year, maybe $100 billion next year, on top of the $500 billion, and it just passed out in the Senate unanimously. Every Republican, every Democrat supported this bill. This is real infrastructure. This is not tied to some tax and spend bill that maybe the gentleman might think is a good idea. We surely don't. We know how damaging it would be to our country and our economy and to middle and lower income families. This is a very bipartisan bill that could be bipartisan here, where we could be a part of a negotiation on something really good, where states wouldn't have to wait months. They've got the money ready to go today. This gives them the flexibility to make their own decisions on what's best for the infrastructure in each of these states. Maryland would be able to control their own destiny on over $1 billion. Louisiana would be control their own destiny on over $1 billion today if this bill passed. So absolutely, we support real infrastructure. If it's tied together and married to something that would be devastating the economy, of course not. And maybe if the majority would look at delinking those two and abandoning the bill that would raise taxes, and even internally in the Democrat conference, those discussions have been going on. That's not just Republicans asking for that. There are a number of Democrats asking for that too. That would be a bipartisan initiative to say we're jettisoning this idea that we're going to raise hundreds of billions, if not multiple trillions, whatever the number. If it's $1 trillion, $5 trillion, it would be devastating to our economy and to middle-class families. Let's abandon that and go work on something that would actually be real infrastructure that we could all rally behind, and it would pass overwhelmingly. Be good for the country. President Biden would get to sign it into law. We would support that, and I'd ask the gentleman to look at S. 3011, and if not a supporter of that plan that passed with 100 senators, maybe there's a better idea, but this one's a really good one that got every Republican and every Democrat in the Senate earlier this week to say yes, and we'd be happy to say yes to it as well if we're given that opportunity, and I'd yield to the gentleman.
Madam Speaker, I think that bill passed the Senate Wednesday, so we'll look at it, but we haven't had a chance to look at it at this point in time. I want to get back. I know this sounds like a broken record on the debt limit, but the gentleman makes the point, Madam Speaker, that somehow we've raised the debt to accommodate spending. That's what you always do, because if you reach the debt limit, you're done. You stop Social Security, you stop veterans payments, you stop any support payments, you stop paying the armed services of the United States. That's the spending you stop when you can no longer incur debt. Why? Because we spent a lot of money and we put it on the credit card and it's coming due, and it comes due on a regular basis, and we got to pay it on a regular basis. And the gentleman has voted for bills that do exactly what the bill he lamented and none of his colleagues voted for, Madam Speaker, exactly what he asked us to do. Extend it by a date. Not a number, by a date. And then he hypothesizes, well, in that time frame, you're going to incur additional expenses. He's absolutely right. So he is lamenting and giving us a reason for his not voting for it is because there are some proposals to spend money in the future. There are lots of them from all sides. And then he brings up this tied together. Let me tell you who's tied it together. The Republican leadership has tied these together, and yes, the president talked about it. He said, no, they're not tied together. He said, first of all, tied together, and they said, no, I negotiated this bill, I'm going to do it. But I will tell him, as the majority leader who brings bills to the floor, the infrastructure bill passed overwhelmingly on a bipartisan vote and put together in a bipartisan vote Republicans, Democrats, and the President of the United States. Now, he is the President of the United States. I know the gentleman voted against certifying his election in a bipartisan move, I suppose. But, Madam Speaker, that bill will be brought up separately. You can vote for that bill on its merits and vote against it on its merits. Do not hide behind you don't like some other bill. Because Donald Trump said he was going to do $1 trillion on infrastructure to help our economy. He didn't do it. Then he said it was going to be $2 trillion. He didn't do it. Republicans were in the majority. They controlled the House and the Senate. They didn't do it. We have a bill they can vote for. I would urge them to vote for extending the debt limit so our country meets its full faith and credit obligations, and for the infrastructure bill, because I think it is a bipartisan bill negotiated by Republicans, by Democrats, and by the President of the United States that will help our economy. And as I said, and I will reiterate, every issue that the gentleman raised, Madam Speaker, in his opening remarks. I yield back, and I'm about to yield.
Thank the gentleman again. And there's clearly a bipartisan bill on infrastructure that we'd be happy to support, S-3011. Nobody in the House on the Republican side was included in any of those negotiations, including the ranking member of the Transportation Committee, who he himself has been urging a large bill. $450 billion was put on the table, which, by the way, if that were passed, it would be the largest infrastructure bill in the history of the United States. And yet, he was pushed out of the negotiations. And again, the majority has that ability because they're in the majority, but they surely never tried a bipartisan negotiation. And as well as the gentleman knows, on those prior budget agreements, wasn't just voted for or against because of who was in the White House. It was voted for by both parties because the negotiation on what that spending limit was agreed upon by the leadership of both sides. House, Senate, Republican, Democrat, we came to agreement on those budgets. And that's why the gentleman voted for it. That's why I voted for it, because it was a negotiated agreement. There were give and take on a number of items. But ultimately, we agreed by a date certain, but under a budget agreement. There's a date certain of December 31st of 2022 that has no bipartisan agreement. We know what a lot of the spending will be because trillions have already been spent that we were not included in. We opposed, strongly opposed. And the gentleman knew that when he brought the bills to the floor, but they wanted to bring them to the floor anyway because you had the votes. And I get it, that's the way majorities work. But if you decide to exclude one party from negotiations and go spend the money anyway, and then have a whole list of trillions more in spending down the road and include that in a bill, don't really think anybody expects the people who are pushed to the curb to vote for the credit card limit being increased when all the spending that's going to continue to be racked up, not that's already been racked up, that would be racked up between now and December 31st of 2022 is going to be done in a partisan way. And that's what the record has been so far this year on the trillions that have already been added by bills passed by this majority. They weren't bipartisan. And again, that's the prerogative of the majority. We've stood here ready. We've listed bill after bill to address crises after crises, none of which have been brought to the floor. We're still ready to go to solve these problems. We've talked about a bipartisan bill on infrastructure that we can support. Ultimately, the majority makes that decision. Yield back.
Madam Speaker, if this Congress had never met this year, we would have to extend the debt limit at some point in time this year. That is a fact. And Mr. McConnell has said it is inconceivable that we would not extend the debt limit of the United States of America and fail our obligation under full faith and credit. As a matter of fact, the Constitution on the 14th Amendment says it shall not be questioned, but we have to take some legislative action. And the issue is, what is our responsibility to the United States of America? Not all this argument that pretends that somehow some bills that are proposed on spending, or some that may have been passed this year, if they hadn't been passed, somehow we wouldn't have to do this. If anybody on either side of the aisle believes that to be the case, they ought to be defeated by their constituents because they don't know what's going on here. On either side of the aisle. And this is a very serious issue with respect to jobs, infrastructure, inflation, health care, environment. All of those will be adversely affected in terms of and the global community itself if we do not extend this debt. We can argue about the other issues, but there's no argument about this issue. Every Republican president has asked that this be done. Every Republican Secretary of Treasury since I've been in this Congress, 41 years, has asked that we extend the debt limit. Every one of them, without fail. And every one of them has said, President Reagan on, that if we did not do it, the country's economy, reputation, and well-being would be put disastrously at risk. I don't want bipartisanship. I want patriotism. I want people committed to their country and their country's well-being to stand up and say, I'm not going to demagogue an issue that is so critically important to the welfare of my nation. And I said to the gentleman again, exactly what we passed, they passed when they were in the majority, and we voted for it, setting a future date. Not a number, a future date. Exactly. We didn't ask them to do anything more than we've done. And in terms of bipartisanship, I will again say, you've got a bipartisan bill, negotiated in a bipartisan way, that would be coming to this floor at some point in time, I hope earlier rather than later, separately. Not tied to, I don't like this bill, I don't like that bill, so I won't do this, I won't do that, won't do the other, which will substantially grow jobs in our country, deal with the climate crisis in our country. And I would ask you to support both of those propositions when they come to the floor in a show of bipartisan support for our country, not for each other, but for our country. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, we need to do this in a bipartisan way, which hasn't happened. But partisanship is not patriotism. And we've seen a lot of partisanship. Again, if President Biden, I've served in leadership under 3 different presidents now, when we had to negotiate how to come together on the priorities of our government, how to properly fund things and deal with our debt, under President Obama, we had those bipartisan meetings in the White House. When President Trump came in, we had those bipartisan meetings in the White House. Still to this day, late October, 10 months into his presidency, there's not been a single time where President Biden has brought a bipartisan group of our leadership together. I understand he's met with Democrat leadership many times in the White House. And again, that's his prerogative. He's the president, you're in the majority. If you want to do all of this in a partisan way, I don't suggest it's healthy. I don't suggest it's the right way. Every president I've served under in leadership has had bipartisan meetings to have these conversations and come to agreement. That has not happened under this president. He ought to go and live by the words that he promised during the campaign, that he would work with both parties in a bipartisan way, to not have met with House Republican leadership once during his presidency 10 months in. It's not an acceptable way to run this government. And then all of a sudden, things end up partisan, and everybody throws their hands up and go, how did this happen? Just reach out. He's the President of the United States. If he says, let's go tomorrow, we'll be there tomorrow, but he won't do that. We've asked for meetings. At some point, they have to happen. Again, if he doesn't want them to happen, that's his prerogative, because the same party controls all levers of government. But if the same party controls all levers of government and wants to just toss aside the other party in either chamber, oh, we worked with senators. Even some of those senators that were mentioned are not supporting what's happening with debt because there's been no negotiation with both parties on the debt, on the spending that gets us to the debt. And so there can be proposals for trillions more in spending. And if we oppose it, we've been very clear about why we have that opposition. It wasn't us who married those bills together. President Biden came here just 2 weeks ago. They said he was going to be closing the deal. He was going to be the closer. They're going to have a vote on the House floor. Speaker promised there would be a vote on the House floor. And instead, at that meeting, it's been reported that he said the 2 bills are tied together. Since then, he said, I want both of them coming to me. He's tied them together. I wish he wouldn't. That's the president's prerogative. He's made it very clear. The Speaker's made it very clear. It's not been our side that's done that. We want to separate those as a package, but they've been kept together as a package. And until then, at least we've been looking for other opportunities, and we found one. In S3011 that passed the Senate unanimously, that would be $500 billion in real infrastructure today. Every governor, every state would have the ability to start doing $500 billion in new infrastructure projects. We think that would be really good for our country. We support it. We're ready to negotiate. I would yield.
Madam Speaker, this needs to come to an end, obviously, but I will tell you this. As I stand here, as somebody who sat on this floor on January 6th, and the question was, would the House perform its function of accepting the Electoral College vote to elect this president? It wasn't that there hadn't been voices in the past who have raised questions. But there was no effort by Ms. Clinton, who received a majority of the votes, or Mr. Gore, who received a majority of the votes, to raise a question about the legitimacy of the election. But we had an insurrection incited by, invited by, and deployed by the President of the United States. So we didn't start on a very good bipartisan basis. Again, not because Republicans should have been happy that their candidate was not elected, or any more than we were happy that our candidate was not elected in the Clinton and Gore campaigns. But it was, at least we ought to uphold the constitutional principles. Vice President Pence did, and there were people in this Capitol on that night who wanted to see him apparently eliminated. That wasn't a good bipartisan start, Madam Speaker. The majority of Republicans voted against certifying the Electoral College results in state after state. But we ought to put that behind us. That's done. What we're doing now is we are acting on behalf of the country. And the two issues that I've dwelt on, because I think we have agreement on that rhetorically and intellectually, but not electorally, not in terms of voting, is the debt limit should never be breached, and that we need to invest in infrastructure. Two simple propositions. The Senate Minority Leader says we should never breach the full faith and credit of the United States of America. But I won't help you do it. I don't get that. Frankly, it seems to me kind of irrational. And then an infrastructure bill passed overwhelmingly by the United States Senate, which we are putting on the floor unchanged, as it was, not coupled, as it is and was, and saying, let's vote for that. I yield back.
We stand ready to work if there is bipartisan efforts made. We'll see if that develops. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.